Hi everyone, Professor King here with again the grainiest video and quite possibly the shiniest skin that you've ever seen on a YouTube video. Today I'm going to be applying some of the literary terms that we've discussed for this week and literary terms that we've discussed previously to an understanding of Henrik Ibsen's play An Enemy of the People. I'm going to list some questions for you to consider once you've read the play and once you've reviewed the web teach on this week's literary terms. So make sure that you have read the play, make sure that you have reviewed that web teach before reading these, because otherwise they're not going to make sense. I'm going to take it to a share screen in just a moment, but as always, when you need to pause and take notes. This isn't entirely a video for taking notes. The questions that I'm asking you in this video are not part of like some assignment that you'll hand in. However, once you generate responses to these questions, those responses will help you to prepare for the discussion board and potentially even an essay assignment that you'll have. So that being said, also remember, sorry, I forgot one more thing. Remember that if you do have questions that come up, to email me, to Canvas message me, and or visit me during my Zoom office hours. I'm more than happy to help. And I'll be in a lighter space with more lighting in it, so you'll be able to see me better. All right, let me take it to the share screen. And let me go here. Let me make these notes as large as possible so that we can see them. All right, so Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, which was published, first acted dramatically in 1882. And again, these are just questions for you to consider once you have done the reading and you're going back and annotating, in a bit more depth. Look over the notes, the highlights, etc., the things that you notice throughout the play, and then ask yourself the following. But again, make sure you've read the play and reviewed the web teach on the literary terms so that this makes sense. All right, so the first question or prompt I have is to consider the dialogue. So think about the way in which certain characters speak to one another and how that changes throughout the play. Whose behavior particularly and their speech changes? Because there's a few. There's not just one character who kind of goes through a shift, and there's not one character who goes through a shift in the way that they address other characters. Sorry if my dog barks. It's because there's people walking outside right now. Anyway, it's not one person whose attitude toward another person changes and therefore their speech and behavior also change. There are characters whose treatment of other characters drastically changes. And again, not just one, there's more than one. There are characters who stay pretty consistent in their message throughout the play, but don't stay consistent in the way they treat somebody else or one another. So think about all of that. Think about all the changes that happen really largely because of as a result of this revelation that Dr. Stockman has about the baths. Who changes, who remains consistent, how do they change, how do they remain consistent, and why do you think Ibsen would construct the dialogue in this way, where he has these people who seem to have very resolute understandings of who they are change so drastically? I don't want to give too much away, but again, if you've read the play, you know what I mean. Why would he do that? What's he saying about that character or the thing or the group that character represents? Also consider themes. What is Ibsen saying about the human condition? He's saying more than one thing, definitely. There are more than one theme going on in this play, but maybe pick one or two or three and consider what Ibsen is saying about the human condition with that theme. And which of the characters are the best conduits through which this thematic truth is being relayed? it may not always be a positive thing, right? It could be a very sort of cynical or pessimistic view of the human condition. Ibsen is more known for tragedy than comedy, so that's a likelihood. But how are we seeing that, again, through the characters, specific characters, and the way that they behave? What's he telling us about this universal truth, about this truth that has to do with the human condition through this character, and why? Also think about protagonists and antagonists. You'll recall in the literary terms notes that a protagonist isn't always the quote unquote good guy, right? And an antagonist isn't always the quote unquote bad guy. The protagonist is just the person or character around whom the plot sort of centers, right? Or on whom the plot centers, the action of the play centers. And the antagonist is the one who challenges the protagonist in a significant way. You can often have, if anyone out there watches like Marvel movies or reads DC or Marvel comic books, you can see that often we have more than one antagonist in a dramatic work. Sometimes we have more than one protagonist too. So keep that in mind, that there is likely more than one antagonist challenging the protagonist in this narrative. And is our protagonist a so-called good guy? Why or why not, in your opinion? And for this one, I really want you to pay close attention to the entire play, particularly the ending, because the ending is very interesting to unpack. And I'm talking about like, you know, literally like the last page, what would be on a page of lines. Does he remain a so-called good guy? Do you think he's a good guy from the jump or not? But make sure you read all the way through, because there's really some fascinating dialogue, again, in the last 10, 15, 20 lines or so that really make you think about, where's this protagonist going? All right, the next question. Are there traits that the antagonists possess that make them likable? Again, we don't always tend to look at the antagonist. We shouldn't always tend to look at the antagonist as a bad guy, but oftentimes they are. A lot of times also bad guys have really likable traits. So are there traits that the antagonists possess that make them likable? If so, who are these characters you're talking about? Who are the antagonists? And what are the characters' likable traits? And how does that add to or confound our understanding of an antagonist? In other words, we have to think about complexity. Ibsen is sort of seen as the godfather of dramatic realism. And if we're talking about realism, if we're talking about, you know, not some sort of glorified or overly dramatized way of looking at the world, but an actual sort of realistic way of presenting events, these are complex characters we're dealing with. Maybe none of them are entirely likable. And if that's the case, when we're talking about antagonists, what are some likable things that really speak to that complexity, and that they're not just sort of like super hyper villains where everything they do is bad, because that's not realistic, right? And then finally, are there any characters who teeter on the dividing line, so to speak, between protagonist and antagonist? Are you looking at anybody in this play and going, you know, I'm not really sure, because the protagonist and the antagonist column are kind of equal, right? Or maybe they are not necessarily a protagonist or antagonist, but they are a supporting character who brings into context that complexity and really doesn't ever make a final decision either way. And so why would Ibsen place them in this liminal space? And what I mean by a liminal space is like a doorway. If you've ever stood directly in the doorway between one room and another, you're neither in one room entirely or the other, right? You're essentially halfway between either one. You're in neither room and you're in both at the same time. Likewise, someone who exists in a sort of liminal social space, or in this case, a liminal space as far as protagonist and antagonist, they're kind of straddling both worlds. And so why would Ibsen make us take the time to note that? So it's a weird question, but it's got cool outcomes if you answer it. So just bear with me. Also, I'm going to scroll down so that we can see the rest. Also think about the climax. Again, you're going to want to review the literary terms notes for clarification on what the climax of a dramatic or narrative plot is, but think about the climax. Where do you think it occurs in this story? In other words, where's the point of no return after which everything else sort of flips the story and we can never go back to how it was before this event? What do you make of that ensuing falling action and denouement? Other terms in the literary terms, dramatic, drama literary terms video that is earlier on in this module. And then think about present day applications that we can make to this, that we can apply this story to. Can you draw parallels when you read through the dialogue or you read through the events in this story? Can you draw parallels between that and something happening today? There are things that like immediately come to my mind, but again, I don't want to stomp on anybody else's imaginative toes. So if you're seeing parallels, maybe they're broad, real world parallels that you see happening globally. Maybe it's something you see happening in your own personal life and or anything else in between. What are those parallels? And how might you view the play overall as a metaphor, perhaps even a warning for the present day phenomenon you're thinking of? I actually used to teach a different play of Henrik Ibsen's, and in the last, I won't tell you how, well, yeah, I'll tell you how long. In the last year and a half or so, I've really been thinking like, man, this would be a great play to share with students in just talking about what's going on in the world. But I don't think that there is just one world event that this applies to. I think there are plenty that we can think about. And again, it doesn't have to be a world event. It can be our own personal lives event that we can apply this to and go, oh yeah, like that character reminds me of X, or that situation reminds me of X, or that action, that event reminds me of X. And so think about maybe what it could be a metaphor or a warning for, and why that might be cool or trippy or a bummer or whatever else. Because I think it's valuable in doing that. I think that's why a lot of us become literature majors, because we want to look at the world from an abstract, artistic, thoughtful way. And literature allows us to do that when we make those applications. So I hope this was helpful. Again, pause where you need to pause. I'll take it off the stop share screen now. And just remember, if questions come up, you can email me, you can Canvas message me, you can visit my Zoom office hours. I'm more than happy to clarify, even though Enemy of the People is an older work, right? It's from 1882. I think it's still pretty doable as far as understanding it. The language, because the language is translated more recently, I think it's pretty doable and helpful. But if there are parts, like when you encounter a word like infusoria, for example, or particularly how a Norwegian community in 1882 defines the word liberal, which is very different than a 2021 American understanding of that word. Some of the things are going to be historically different, and the historical context or the cultural context in which they're stated is different than what we're experiencing now. But overall, this should be a pretty digestible, graspable play for us to read. So I hope that helped. And always hit me up if you have questions. Always pause if you need to take notes, or just take a pause. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day, evening, weekend, week, wherever you're at. Thanks a lot, and I will see you in cyberspace. Bye.